Hello everyone, do you remember who I am? Hello everyone, it's been a long time since I've filmed a video for this channel, but if you are new here or if you don't remember me, which I completely understand, my name is Jalen and I review books on here. I also interview authors for my podcast, Reading the Room, but I'm missing the video aspect of my channel and I'm so sorry for being away for so long. If anyone, misses the wrap-ups, I haven't posted a formal one since March, which means I've read many books over the summer, and I have not talked to you all about them formally. I've filmed many podcasts about them. I've had a couple other videos where I've talked about some of them, but this is the mega summer reading wrap-up. I'm just going to go off the cuff. I haven't prepared for this. Who knows what I remember? This might not be the most substantive video, but we're going to go through the books that I've read over the summer. Before I get into the books that I read, I would love to hear from you all. What's the best book that you read over the summer? What is your least favorite book you read over the summer? Anything you want to share since we last, spoke? I would love to hear from you all. But okay, let's go through it. Back in April, I read Monsters by Claire Dederer. I interviewed Claire about this book, and it is one of my favorite nonfiction books probably I've ever read. It is very much a question that was top of mind when I picked this up over the last few years. This question of whether we can separate the art from the artist is a conversation that I see all the time in discourse, particularly on the bookish internet. And the question is raised in this book. However, I don't think she necessarily answers the question, which I think the best criticism does. She really leans into subjectivity of herself as a reader and as a writer, and thinking about this balance that she feels between having this profound sense of attachment to art, but also having the artist's biography also lingering in your mind. So how do you kind of balance these forces of wanting to condemn an artist for certain behaviors in their biography or in their past with the inherent love and reverence that you have for a work of art? Like, can those two things exist at one time? And I think she concludes, I guess there is an answer here. I think she concludes that yes, that is possible, but it is a very, you can't really dismiss one or the other. I think there are two forces that are always at play when you're consuming a work of art, and that's just kind of part of the process. She also goes into many specific aspects within this question. For example, she also explores what it means to be a critic. She thinks about female monsters and what it means to be a mother, and being a monstrous woman is a particular inquiry that she goes into. It's just a really good book. So if you ever have thought about these questions, I highly recommend that you pick that one up. Romantic Comedy by Curtis Sittenfeld. This is not a usual book that I would read. It's not my typical fare, I would say, but I really had a good time with this one. It was very much a well-constructed rom-com. It follows a woman who's working at what is basically a fictional version of SNL, and she falls in love with a big star who is a guest host during a season that she's working on the show. And what I really thought was surprising about this book was that it's structured in a way that was really clever, I would say, for lack of a better word. I really liked how she also works in elements of COVID, and she has an epistolary section in the middle of the book that was my favorite section, which kind of raises the stakes of the romance. But yeah, I wouldn't say this is my normal book that I would typically read, but I will say I was very surprised by it and really enjoyed my time. And I had a really fun time talking to Brandon Taylor, author of The Late Americans, during my interview with him, where we talk about this book. And that was actually the other book that I read this month. And so The Late Americans, as you may know, Brandon Taylor is one of my all-time favorite writers. He is one that made me want to start interviewing authors back when I read Real Life in February of 2020, before I even started this channel. And he's just a writer that I followed closely. I love his Twitter account. I always love his takes and his criticism. And so getting him on the podcast was a huge personal achievement for myself. I could not believe it. It was so cool to finally get to meet him and get to talk about his fiction, his criticism. And also I asked him about Drag Race during that interview. So if you like Drag Race, that's another fun thing that we touch on there. But going to his book, The Late Americans, it feels to me like this interesting blend of what he's doing in real life, his debut novel, and Filthy Animals, his story collection, in which this novel is told from a group of perspectives amongst a bunch of people that are in grad school and trying to make it, and falling in and out of love with each other in these very complex, sometimes toxic relationships. And what does it mean to be pursuing a career in art? What does it mean to try to discover yourself through art and being an artist? And he does it through a really interesting lens of having, namely, my favorite character in the book, his name is Seamus, and he is a poet. And in the beginning of this book, it's really cool how I think Brandon is kind of leaning into more of his critical modes of writing through a fictional lens through this character, and kind of letting that kind of fly on the page, which was really fun to see. So I feel like the late Americans is kind of doing everything that Brandon is good at in one contained book, which is really cool to see. I mean, I think each of his works all do their own kind of thing, but it was cool to see him kind of take his prior work and kind of distill it into one piece of fiction, which is a novel, and seeing all that at play was really interesting. So yeah, if you want like a messy relationship campus novel that's really smart and that is more kind of evocative of the classics, but setting it in a present moment, I think you will really like this book. Burnham Wood by Eleanor Catton. She was a new to me writer at the time, and this book, since reading this in April, has stayed in my mind so much and has kind of grown higher and higher, like on my internal list of books that I've read, that I think it's in like my top 10 now. Like I cannot stop thinking about this book and I already want to reread it. It is so good. So basically it follows this guerrilla gardening group in New Zealand. And you might be wondering, like, what does that mean? So basically, to put it incredibly simply, it is this group that kind of like sneaks into properties and plants, for example, and they kind of use their tactics to try to make environmental change. And so the conflict arises when we have this group and some central characters in it, naming 3 characters, and how they are sort of like fighting the force of evil that is Robert Lemoyne, who is the antagonist of this novel, who also gets his time in the book in terms of leaning into his perspective, as he is kind of this, mega rich guy who gets involved with this guerrilla gardening group and the fallout that ensues from that relationship. And what I think this book does so well is that it not only has like the stakes and the plot there in terms of seeing what will happen with this group and their endeavor and what it means to kind of fall into greed, and contrasting that with the very interesting character studies of each of these 4 central characters in this book. I think this book is a masterclass in how you balance plot with characterization and using this close third narration to really get in the minds of Eleanor Catton's characters. And just like on the level of prose, on the level of plot, of character, like, and just the way that this is set up like a Shakespearean tragedy in a way. Like I was so floored by the end of this book. I did not expect it. I had seen some reviews saying that it is a tragedy, and I don't think it's much of a spoiler to say that, given the epigraph of this book being Macbeth, and what Eleanor Catton's saying from like a moralist perspective is really interesting as well. Like, I don't know, this book is just magnificent, if you can't tell, and like how much it kind of stayed with me. Gone to the Wolves by John Ray, another author that I had on the podcast, and this is another one that I think balances good plot with good writing, but a much different style here. I say if you liked Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, you'll really like this book. It follows a group of friends who all have sort of different backgrounds and how their friendship kind of underpins them as they discover themselves in the heavy metal scene in the 80s, particularly within Florida. And how one of those friends, she disappears, and 2 of the other friends have to go find her later in the novel. I really like this book because it immersed me in a setting and like a time that I'm not as familiar with, particularly in a heavy metal scene, and how the book is definitely paying homage to that time in music history, but also rooting the sense of the novel in friendship first and foremost, and then kind of leaning later into like a more of a crime thriller feel was really interesting. So yeah, if any of that sounds good to you, I'd pick this one up if you want something kind of plotty about friendship and about found family. You'll really like this book, I think. And the end was like really wild and kind of leans into horror as well. So yeah, it's doing a lot, but I think it does it all really well. Whatever by, I need to look up how to pronounce this author's name. I think it's Michel Houellebecq. He's a French writer. And this book came on my radar because I interviewed Esther Yee, who is the author of Your Name, which came out back in March, who was on the podcast. And she, on that podcast, recommended Houellebecq. And she said that he is one of the, if not the most important living writers that we have. And that is some quite high praise, I must say. So I was looking into his bibliography and I saw this was his debut novel. It was kind of on the shorter side, and I tried it out, and I will say I don't remember a lot of the plot of this book, but I don't think there was much of a plot. But what I will say is that this book is kind of like, it's focusing on the interiority of an incredibly depressed man who sort of has everything. He has a good job, he is well off, but he's very uncomfortable in his skin and living in the world, and just seeing his perspective and kind of his scathing unlikableness rendered on the page very explicitly. I think it's a really interesting portrait of depression and anxiety and what it feels like to be a human in the present time, and I think he does it in a really stark and visceral way. I want to read more of his work to be able to say something more of substance about him and his work. I know I think he's a bit of a controversial figure for reasons that I'm not completely sure about. But yeah, I really like this book from what I read, and I'm intrigued to pick up more. I picked up The Elementary Principles, I believe it's called. I think it's another, or his most popular work of his. But completely switching gears, I read Happy Place by Emily Henry. I don't really read romance. This one and romantic comedy were the two romances that I've read. I remember at this time, I lost my dog around this time, and I was like needing some like light stuff, and I balance out with some dark stuff as I do. But this one, I think Emily Henry is very much just good at what she does in terms of crafting these really propulsive and just well crafted romance stories. I mean, it is commercial fiction. It is very much deep in the romance bag, but I think if you're ever in the mood for that, if you want something very light and breezy to read, like she's going to do it for you. I also read her book Book Lovers last summer, and I had a very similar feeling. Like it wasn't anything revolutionary for me personally as a reader, but it was just a really good, comforting read. And like near the end of it as well, it kind of made me want to change my life, and I have in many ways since then. So maybe I need to give Emily Henry a shout out for like helping me have the courage to like leave my prior career and stuff. I don't know, but yeah, good romance for sure. Fortunately, like my least favorite book of the year so far, probably it's August Blue by Deborah Levy. This one, don't remember much of it. It follows a pianist and this woman who's seeing her doppelganger around, I forget what country this is set in as well. But basically, this is about art and about identity. But aside from that, it is very fragmented and sort of leans into some kind of strangeness in terms of like how it explores identity and doubles, and how this woman is seeing someone who looks just like her but isn't her, and her trying to grapple with her past and her family and her career pursuits as an artist. So it has like the bones of something I would like, but it just didn't really cohere for me in terms of narrative, and it just kind of felt a little I don't know. I don't know if inaccessible is the right word. I want to try one or two more of hers, but this one was not for me, unfortunately. Shai by Max Porter. This one is a formally very interesting and different book, probably the most singular in terms of like form and text on the page that I read this year, but that's what like Max Porter is really known for. It follows this young, I believe, teenager at a boarding school who is there following some violent acts that he's committed, and he escapes this boarding school in the middle of the night, and he's kind of reckoning with himself and what he's done and thinking about his recent past and what he wants to do next. So it's a very tight and focused narrative over the course of one night where he kind of spirals and thinks about many different voices in his head. And it's very like interior and very literally interior in that the book plays with text for different voices. It kind of blends words across pages in interesting ways. It sort of reads like a prose poem as well. So if you want something that's kind of a very fast-paced read about a young troubled boy and how he's grappling with all these forces, I think this is one that you should check out. And if you like Max Porter's work, like I did, I liked his book Lanny that I read a couple of years ago. I like this one even more. So it's my favorite Max Porter so far. So yeah, I like Shai a lot. Quietly Hostile by Samantha Irby. I mean, what more can I say about this book? I love Samantha Irby. She's one of my favorite essayists. She's hilarious. I read all of her books the minute that they come out on audio, and it's a blast every single time. She writes really well about herself and the body and the weirdness of being a human, and also about art and culture in really funny ways. And now, you know, in her booming career, how that's all kind of taken off for her and her grappling with all of that. Just always a good time listening to Samantha Irby, and her narration is perfect. So if you like audiobooks, I highly recommend listening to them on there as well. The other name, Septology 1 and 2 by Jan Fosse, who just won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And I did this in part on audio, which I think was where I went wrong, because this book is very much a stream of consciousness, one long sentence novel. It is an ambitious literary project following this man who is living in Norway, and it's a lot about art and religion and thinking about God, and it's in God's place in art making. And he also has a doppelganger. I'm having a bad time with doppelganger novels, I'm just realizing, but who is also, I think he's older than it. I think he's like an older version of him that lives somewhere else in Norway, but he looks just like him, and he's an alcoholic. And the book is thinking about these two versions of the same man and the choices that we make in making art and religion. And in terms of plot, this book took some really surprising turns. But when I was listening to it, the prose always repeats itself, and it's very cyclical and repetitive. And so when you're listening to it, it kind of feels like you're losing your mind a little bit. Like I was like, okay, I get the conceit. I get it's trying to kind of lean into the stream of consciousness style, but I just couldn't really get the swing of it. And I feel like this is a book that if you can, reading it, just the text on the page and just kind of letting yourself fall into it, will be a fundamentally different experience, just given how this book is constructed in terms of its prose. And so I want to try more of him. I might try 3 and 4 in print and seeing if I like them more, because I loved the philosophical exploration of this book. It was just the execution and the repetition that was just like driving me kind of nuts. So I don't know if it was a me thing. He just won the Nobel, so now I'm like, okay, I'm clearly wrong in that opinion. So who knows? But that was my experience when I read that back in May. Next up, Emma Cline, The GOAT. I read The Guest. This book has been incredibly controversial, but one of the coolest things that's happened to me in terms of like my, I don't know, online bookish journey has been, I was quoted in Vanity Fair regarding my theory on the ending of this book, which is wild. So I cannot believe little old me, Jalen, the bar in the bookcase, was quoted in Vanity Fair for my opinion on a book. Feeling very validated, I must say. Maybe I can read, who knows? But yeah, this book I really liked. It is a very suspenseful and very it is a very specific book in terms of it following a woman who is this sort of interloper. She's a mess. She's a hot mess. She is in this toxic relationship with this guy. She's kind of fleeing that relationship. We don't know a lot about her past. And she's in this new relationship with this other guy, and how she's trying to find a sense of stability in this relationship and in herself. She's also battling addiction and her past, which you don't know a lot about. And I will say, I've talked a lot on this channel about this idea of like the trauma plot, but I will say this book isn't necessarily falling into those discussions. It's very much a visceral and like voyeuristic account of the reader being very closely tied to this character and watching kind of her spiral and her trying to survive and constantly trying to reach to the next step in terms of where is she going to go next, where can she fit in briefly to make it to the next day, and the disastrous consequences of her actions when she's trying to stay afloat amidst all of this. I couldn't put it down. And aside from like just the plot being very engaging, I think Emma Cline's psychological astuteness and like her observations about humanity and about how people behave is rendered so well in this. Like I just loved, my favorite part of this was reading about how she explores like how she studies humanity and the weird things that people do, and how Alex kind of capitalizes on those things and like figuring out, okay, how do I make myself seem like I fit in given how other people see me? And those observations were just so brilliant in containing them in this narrative that's very propulsive. It makes you not want to put it down. Like, I just don't know what more you could want from like a summer read. Like, I just loved it. And if you've read this book and you want to know my take on the ending, I'm not going to spoil it here, but it is in Vanity Fair, so I'll link that below. North Woods by Daniel Mason, a book that I hold very near and dear to my heart because this is a book that I read in the process of getting the job that I have now at Penguin Random House. And now it just has been published, and this book, I think, is just a feat. It is an incredibly ambitious novel following a bunch of different stories over the course of hundreds of years in this one house in New England. So we see a bunch of different characters who inhabit this house, and Daniel Mason embodies different storytelling techniques to tell very different stories, all connected to this house, and really, I don't know, giving a testament to American history and what it means for a house to kind of be a centering force for a narrative and how that can kind of bleed out into different modes of storytelling. It's just really gorgeous. It's ambitious. It's really different from anything that I've read this year. And I do think, if I'm making a prediction, I must say, I think this one will at least be a Pulitzer Prize finalist. It is so good. It is so different. And if you like books that kind of are novels and stories that play with different storytelling modes, actually, I want to reread this very soon because I've read it in this really like hectic time in my life, but I feel like it needs a slower read from me. So I will be rereading it at some point soon. And BookTube legend Rick, he just did a book review of this book and he loved it as well. So go check that out if you want a deeper exploration of this book, if you're on the fence about picking it up. But yeah, that was a great one. A beast of a novel. I read 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. I read this with the Center for Fiction reading group this year. This was, first of all, it was a tome. It was a beast of a novel. It is nearly 1,000 pages. It is weird. It is 5 novels in one, basically. And how am I going to even talk about this succinctly? It is one of the most challenging yet also accessible books that I've ever read. Like, it's from a prose level, on a sentence level, it is so easy to read and get through, but the ideas explored here using the 5-part structure that are all different from each other, and exploring themes of death and femicide in Mexico, and the idea of creation of art and insanity and madness. Like those are the central themes of this book that are all tied to these very different characters across these 5 parts of the novel. And what I think this book succeeds at so well is in terms of its kind of metafictionality, in the sense that each part stands alone. They were each published on their own. Per Bolaño's request, he wrote this book near his death, and it's very much exploring what it means to be creating art so close to death, and how he looks at literal, murder in the 4th part of this book, looks at a fictionalized Ciudad Juarez and the many murders of women that occurred there in the 4th part of the book. And aside from that, it's also looking at this kind of creation of novels, creation of art. What is the meaning of art? Is the creation of art like applicable to madness? Like, is there some kind of level of needing to be insane, quote unquote, to create art? Is there a way to understand the meaning of life through art? How can you replicate that experience in art? I'm rambling now. I probably said nothing of what I just said probably makes any sense, but I think I want to do a book review of this book where I can have more time to kind of explore what I think about this, because it was one of the most challenging and kind of like life-changing books in terms of how I think about fiction and the possibilities of it. Like, really takes on the capacious form of the novel in a way that I've never really read before. So yeah. Anyways, crazy book. I'm so happy I read it though. Like, I love a juicy, long, challenging book. I just need to either have a group to read them with or just make a more concerted effort to like take the time to do it. I feel like it's very easy to fall into like reading shorter books to have more content, but really sitting with a long book over a couple of months is just like one of the best reading experiences that you can have, I think, really taking time with art. So that book definitely taught me that. More of a thriller satire novel, I read Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This book, I think, succeeds in what it's trying to do in writing a very, scathing, funny, dark, and biting satire of the publishing industry. I don't really know what I can add to the conversation on this book that hasn't already been said. I will say this book is incredibly, on the nose. And I've seen some critiques of the novel saying that it is like too on the nose, like it should have leaned more into the satire if it was going to be satirical, should have leaned more into literary qualities if it was going to be literary. But I think just from like a quick romp that is smart and engaging and will make you want to finish it like instantly, this book does a really good job, and also of critiquing, the publishing industry. And if you want like a novelized version of like the American Dirt controversy from a couple years ago, yeah, I would say read this book. I Will Greet the Sun Again by Kash Kabushani, friend of the podcast, and just such a lovely human. I will just start and say that. This is his debut novel, and I loved this book so much. It is a coming-of-age story following a young narrator named Kay. It is looking at him as a child as he grows up, as a young Iranian-American boy, and him dealing with growing up being queer and living with an abusive father, and explores ideas of identity, of kind of being both. I feel like that there's very much this kind of rooted sense of kind of feeling somewhat dislocated, in the sense that you feel like you're in many places at once, or you're two identities, and thinking about the kind of duality of that experience of being Iranian American. Talking about this book and just kind of watching the publication of this now that I'm working at Hogarth has just been so wonderful, and seeing the response of this book has been so amazing, and I just am really rooting for him, and I think this book is so well written and gorgeous. And I love autofiction, so it was really fun to ask him about. And he talks about kind of the freedom of writing a novel about some autobiographical aspects of his life, but having the room to live a different experience or a different reality in his mind that he didn't get to live in, real life. And the kind of ability that fiction allows for writers to have that experience, I think, is really beautiful. So the queer mountain lion novel that I feel like everyone's been talking about, it's Open Throat by Henry Hoke. This is a weird one, definitely singular in terms of its form and how it's sort of a prose poem as well. It follows a queer mountain lion living in the Hollywood Hills, and him grappling with his, desire to eat people. And it ends up sort of being this kind of very interesting satire about consumerism, about Americans, and also about queerness, and about how he, meaning Henry Hoke, is exploring this idea of queerness through a mountain lion. I'm not really sure what I want to say about this book right now. I really enjoyed the experience of reading it, but it is very much like a fever dream. But it is really smart and engaging, and I read it in, I think, like 2 hours. It's a very quick read. But yeah, I enjoyed it. I had nothing really smart to say about it, though, I must say. We the Animals by Justin Torres, a book that I have missed, but I've seen as sort of like a contemporary queer classic, and I really liked it. I think it is very similar to a book I previously spoke about, I'll Greet the Sun Again, following kind of the experience of like singular young boyhood in fraught family dynamics and what that feels like, and kind of the sense of not kind of fully having the words to understand what you're going through, and then later in life kind of processing them through a narrative format. I think they're both really excellent at doing that. Right by Sarah Rose Etter. She was on the podcast. This book is so good. I love this book. It is following a woman named Cassie who is working at a startup in Silicon Valley. Well, I won't draw any conclusions here. She basically has a black hole that's following her, that is a real character that's kind of lingering over her shoulder. And it can be a symbol for whatever the reader kind of wants to impose on it. But I interpreted the book as it dealing with, depression and anxiety, and then kind of the growing force of that over a character who is suffering in late stage capitalism, what it feels like to have a job that makes you feel dead inside, and also having people around you that kind of add on to that effect, whether it be a boyfriend, a love interest, a boss, or being kind of apart from your family, and what that feels like as well, kind of being alone and in solitude, and facing head on what that feels in terms of like being in your body, what that feels like, how it kind of sucks away at your soul, and how she uses these different symbols to kind of get at that. But what I think this book does so well is that it plays with form in really fun ways. So it has a lot of definitions that introduce certain sections of the book. It also is structured in a way that resembles a pomegranate and the structure of a pomegranate, and the kind of peeling back of the layers of that. It also explores the science and philosophy around black holes and the science of that. And she kind of uses all of these forces to make a novel out of it. And I think she really embraced the ambitiousness of that project while also centering the story in a very literal and starkly realistic depiction of working and what it means to be a working class person. Similar book that I read, Daniel Hornsby joined me to talk about Sucker, is similarly looking at Silicon Valley, but this one is more of a biting satire, literally, in that it follows vampires. It's a vampire story. And what I think this book does really well is that it kind of leans into kind of the vampiric aspects of the story in the second half, but in the first half, well, through the whole book, I would say as well, it really is this interesting character study of our main character, who is from a very privileged, rich family, and he's trying to make his own way in the world. Like, how is he going to do that? He wants to get involved in music, but then he ends up getting involved with this company, and he's also just a really unlikable character, and I love that. This book kind of reminded me of one of my favorite books of all time, Fake Accounts, in terms of it kind of blending this idea of satire with a more traditional plot structure, and doing it in kind of innovative ways as well. So yeah, in terms of the prose and like the style and just the really good writing and satirical commentary that kind of feels like criticism at times, I really like this book for that. And then I also just love vampire stories. So another satire, I was having a little bit of a satire moment over the summer. I read Pure Cosmos Club by Matthew Binder. This one is really funny and kind of singular book in terms of how it's exploring a very interesting character. Our main character is a bit of an eccentric, sort of oddball, kind of different from everyone in the world kind of character, and how he thinks about the world and how he sees and interprets it, and how Matthew Binder kind of leans into this character's kind of skewed perception of reality and makes the reader wonder like what they're reading. Is it true or is it not? And how Matthew leans into his satire about art, consumerism in this book. And also it has one of my favorite characters, Blanche, which is a dog who can speak and has opinions about culture, and is just a really funny character as well. So yeah, this one was a really good time. I talked to Matthew about this on my podcast as well. If you're looking for some good contemporary satirical writing, I would recommend this one. 19 Claws and a Black Bird by Agustina Basterica. She wrote Tender as a Flesh, which is a viral TikTok darling. I feel like many horror fans have read that book. I myself also read it and was disgusted and, very riveted by it. I liked this collection. I will say it's kind of left my brain since reading it. I read it on a plane going overseas to Spain, and I feel like I always have a weird time when I'm reading like while I'm traveling like that, especially like in transit. I feel like things kind of don't stick on my brain as much as they do if I'm like in this room reading. But they are very weird and kind of surrealist, horror-leaning stories that kind of raise more questions than they answer and are just kind of deeply unsettling. Yeah, it was good to kind of dip in and out of on that vacation, but I have nothing more really to say about it. Next, a surprise hit for me was The Rachel Incident by Carolyn O'Donoghue. This one is a coming-of-age story that follows these two young friends who are working at a bookstore in Ireland, and one of the friends gets involved with their professor. And I loved it because it was, like a girl and her gay best friend. Like, I love that setup for a story, but it was also about books, about kind of growing up and trying to discover yourself and amidst love, and keeping, an anchoring of friendship at the center of the story was really interesting. It is very much similar to like Sally Rooney, I will say. It was just a complete romp. It was so heartwarming. It was really surprising by the end. I had a couple of twists that I wasn't expecting. Like it was just a pure good romp for me. And a similar note, we have another family saga that I loved. It's weird how these books kind of come in similar groupings, but I read Hope by Andrew Ridker. He came on the podcast, and this one is giving like Jewish Jonathan Franzen, I will say. It follows a family who is at a crossroads, wink, wink. The book is very cleverly structured in focusing on each of the family members at the sort of turning point in their family history and seeing kind of what led each of the characters to kind of come to where they are now and whether this family is going to be able to come back together and make it through this crisis or whether they're going to kind of all go on their own way. And I think this is really a very funny novel. But I would say my favorite aspect of this book is how it looks at each of these characters and kind of gives them a full kind of fleshing out. So you don't really feel like there's one kind of character in the family that you didn't get enough time with or you wish you knew more about. Like you really get a proper time in the backstory and present moment of each of these characters. You can kind of make your own sort of questions or suspicions about where the character is going to go next. I love novels that really focus on the family as a structure and kind of seeing what you can do with that in interesting ways. And I will say this is one of my favorite discussions I ever had on my podcast. Like Andrew is totally brilliant. Him and I feel like have very similar interest in reading, and it was really cool seeing how all of his different influences kind of informed this book. And he was just so engaging. I could listen to him talk all day. So that's one of my favorite episodes. If you want to check it out, learn more about the book, he's brilliant as well. The Look Back Window by Kyle Dylan Hertz. This is a brilliant book. Follows a young queer man who is making the decision of whether he wants to take legal action against his former abusers due to the Child Victims Act, which allows a 1-year kind of grace window to bring a case against perpetrators of sexual abuse. And this book follows in the present moment this character is kind of grappling with his decision and his current relationships and how this potential for justice is kind of impacting his understanding of himself, of what he wants to do with his future. Like how has that trauma informed his present? Is he burdened by it or is he not? Like, can he move past it without therapy or without coping mechanisms? Like, how much is that trauma a part of him? And I think this book very cleverly addresses the pitfalls of the trauma plot discussion that's been going on this year. And I think it was a really brilliant and unlike anything else I've ever read book on the subject of trauma, particularly from a queer lens. And it's very harrowing, it's very dark, but I think he leans very directly into all these themes for a very important reason. And I highly recommend you read this if that at all sounds intriguing to you. He's a really smart and exciting writer, and I also had him on the podcast, so check that out if you're interested. Next, I read a story collection called White Cat, Black Dog by Kelly Link. She has a new book coming out in February, which I'm really excited about. It is a tome of a book, which is her debut novel, but this is a collection of stories that leans into like fairy tales and surrealism and also a lot about queerness, which I was not expecting upon picking this up. But I will say this is a perfect collection if you want something kind of fairy tale like that kind of plays on classic fairy tales but lends them a modern sensibility. And I just think she's a really good storyteller. Like it's just kind of classic kind of feeling of when you read like a storybook as a kid, but now put it like from an adult perspective, like you'll get that similar feeling while not feeling like you're reading like a children's book by any means. It just kind of uses those as inspiration, if that makes sense. So very strong story collection, great writer. Excited to read her debut novel. Mating by Norman Rush, which is a book Twitter critic darling back in the 90s. I read this book for my podcast in which I was joined by critic, one of my favorite writers, Lauren Euler, and we talked about this book. And so we did a full, spoiler discussion of the book, but this one is a really smart and just like insanely well-written book following a graduate student in Botswana who gets in this relationship with this guy who is trying to build this matriarchal society in Africa and her falling in love with him. And it's all about this idea of mating and heterosexual relationships, what it means to tie yourself to another person, what does it mean for your own identity. It's also a study of Botswana in this time about anthropology. It's very big brained. It's a very, dense intellectual read, but it's also very funny. And the narrator of this book, she is unlike any other narrator I think I've ever read in terms of how her voice is rendered on the page, like probably the most singular narrative voice I've ever encountered on the page. Like once you read this book, this character will never leave your mind. She's unnamed in the book. It was cool to see how that book was an influence on Fake Accounts by Lauren Euler, one of my favorite books of all time, kind of similar in its voiciness and its critical understanding of a time and kind of really rooting itself in the present moment of that specific time and the benefits to the novel when you kind of aren't afraid to really make something that feels attached to a certain time and place. which I think Fake Accounts does as well. My Husband by Maud Ventura. This is a French translated work. Really fun, really smart look at a woman who is obsessed with her husband. And as the book goes on, I don't want to spoil anything too much, but you learn kind of more into her neuroses and why she's obsessed with her husband. It's a really smart look at marriage, about relationships, about the things that we hide from our partners. And the end of this book, not to spoil anything, but the ending made this book for me. And it's just a really good, if you want like an unhinged woman narrator, but looking more directly at marriage and more about like obsession in terms of being completely and devastatingly obsessed with someone that you already have and what that feels like. I feel like it's kind of different from other stories that are in a similar vein, but really surprising and really engaging. The Vaster Wild by Lauren Groff. She came on the podcast, which is completely wild, but this one is an adventure narrative following a young servant girl who's escaping this colonial settlement, and she is fleeing the wilderness. So this book is very much a survival story following this young girl as you see whether she's going to make it through her journey, while also reflecting on her past and how she made the choice to flee this settlement. And this book is really smart in how it's engaging with traditional adventure narratives and captivity narratives. And so it's very much a feminist kind of response to those books, including, for example, Robinson Crusoe. And in my conversation with Lauren, I asked her about Middlemarch, which I know is a book that she loves as well. But just this idea of where the author factors into these sort of narratives and kind of the idea of a warm, authorial, godlike voice and how she thinks of herself in her place as Lauren Groff, the writer, when crafting these stories. She does some really interesting things with narration and voice, especially near the end of her book, that I think is just so brilliant and beautiful and unlike anything I've really read. Like, I feel like when you read a Lauren Groff book, like, you know it's a Groff book, and I feel like it's a testament to her leaning into her inspirations, and she's just incredibly well read. And yeah, it's always like a different experience for me when I read her books, but it's always surprising and engaging on that front. So the last 15 pages, man, it is just, it's so good. If you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. The Librarianist by Patrick DeWitt. It's at once a very quiet novel, but it also has a plot, has a lot going on for it. But it follows a retired librarian who gets involved at the senior center. The book is exploring kind of how he came to be who he is today. He's a kind of quiet, solitary guy. He lives on his own, and you learn about his very quiet life, but there's a couple of moments in his life that are very life-altering for him in terms of his relationships and people that kind of made him the person that he is today. And it's a look at those things. And I will say, my favorite aspect of this book was exploring his prior relationship with a woman and his best friend and how that all kind of fell out for him and how that plays in the present narrative. That was my favorite part of this book. It was just really twisty and surprising, and just couldn't really see what was going to come for that. But there is a third part of this book when he's a child that was very long and incredibly boring, in my opinion. I get what he was trying to do in terms of kind of finding a quiet moment that's specific to an individual person and how everyone's life has a story to it, and that matters, and really thinking about how kind of the quiet moments of a person can make for an entertaining novel. But for me, that part was just a little bit too long, a little bit too backstory driven, that I was just kind of taken out of it, and I wanted more of the present moment. It just didn't succeed for me in terms of narrative. But aside from that, I mean, not a lot to complain about. It just wasn't completely successful for me as a reader, I would say. Another metafictional, mind-altering book was Terra's Story by Hilary Leichter, who also came on the podcast. This is a book told in 4 parts that I feel like is very resonant of Trust by Hernan Diaz, which won the Pulitzer. Very different, though, in terms of this book having 4 parts, but it's exploring this idea of addition and subtraction in narrative, but looking through a very literal and also kind of like sci-fi surrealist lens of an apartment that has a terrace that when you open it, or when a certain character opens it, it opens onto a terrace that wasn't there before. It's usually a closet, but this character has the ability of making a new realm, basically. And what it means to have a character that can kind of create new things on a whim through her brain, who has this sort of superpower to create new space in the world. And what I think this book does so well is that at the same time, Hilary Leichter is rendering this surreal superpower that this character has, but also using the form of narrative and novel writing to really see how much can you fit in a novel in a very concise time frame, a very concise page count, and what does it mean to add something to something that already exists, meaning that this book originated from a short story and she added now in the novel form 3 more parts to it. And what does it mean? How does that alter what we understand about a story that was previously published? And how can you create new spaces in the mind of a reader? I feel like she's very intrigued by questions of the connection between writer and reader and the capacity for narrative to change the way that we think about the world and the way that we understand ourselves. And so I just think she's so brilliant and such a warm writer and person as well. She was lovely to speak with, and I love chatting with her. But that one will kind of break your brain in many ways, but will also break your heart. And I think the best novels do that. So that is Tara's story. I have not seen enough people read this book, and it is The Beginners by Anne Sayre. This is another piece of French literature, and this one follows a love triangle. It is a very short novel following a woman who is in a very happy marriage with a man. I think they're married. They're at least in a long-term relationship, and she's very happy, totally fine, living her days in a very contented relationship. But one day, she's walking down the street and she sees this guy, and she falls in love with him. It's very love at first sight, and she doesn't really know what this means. Like, how can she fall in love with someone when she's already in love and she feels fine? And the book explores this kind of duality in her of whether she wants to stay with her current man or leave him for this other guy, or can she have both? Like, what does this mean for her? It's a very simple plot in terms of a woman kind of having this late life reckoning and falling in love with someone else. But this book is so smart in how it, one, explores love and connection as a philosophical inquiry. Like, what does it mean to love someone? What does it mean to want to tie yourself to one person? Why do we consider monogamy to be the norm? Like, what does that mean? But then also from a plot perspective, this book has some twists that will catch you off guard. And I won't say what they are, but I was just so like engaged and floored and kind of like not confused, but I was like, what is this book doing? And I love when a novel constantly raises that question for you. Like, what is this thing doing? Where is this going to go? And it's just so smart and warm and also sort of heartbreaking on the page. So yeah, this one, I think if you like Normal People by Sally Rooney a little bit, but more kind of like heady and philosophical, like this is a book for you, for sure. Next, another surprise, The Ninth Hour by Alice McDermott. This one came out back in 2017, and McDermott is a new to me writer, but I'm reading her new book coming out in a couple weeks from FSG called Absolution. And she's coming on the podcast, which is crazy, but she won the National Book Award back in '98. She is a prolific contemporary American writer, and I wanted to check her out, so I tried this one. And the book follows a plot that I wouldn't normally pick up myself. It follows a group of Irish Catholic nuns in Brooklyn in the early 1900s, and following this group of nuns and how they help people and try to make better for their community in a family that gets entangled with this group of nuns. And I will admit on paper, like that synopsis is not something that I myself would be instantly drawn by. But what I will say is that when you open this book, you read the first page, like everyone watching this, go read the first page of the book and tell me you don't want to keep reading, or you just will keep reading and then you'll want to talk to me about the ending because you just cannot put it down once you start. It opens on a man who is making the choice for reasons that we don't understand to unalive himself. And then it deals with his wife who is grieving and she's pregnant and how this group of nuns helped her through that. And there's more to the story that I won't even get into. And the ending of this book, I was gagged, y'all. I was gagged. First of all, from the way it's constructed is marvelous, but also the book is so dark but also warm. And it reminded me a lot of Sula by Toni Morrison, not necessarily in terms of content or like what the story is about, but just in the way that the story is told and the similar kind of feelings that it evokes in terms of both how it explores community and the horror of living and like dealing with good versus evil and what it means to kind of live a life that is so naturally kind of anchored by horrific events in our lives. Like, how do we live with the kind of constant fear or bad things that happen to people, and how do you make good despite that? This book completely floored me, and so I'm so excited to talk to Alice, and I can't wait to dive into more of her catalog. And I implore you all to read it, even if the synopsis doesn't immediately engage you. Like, just try it out anyways, and I promise, like, it is a novel of like the highest tier. It's so good. And then I read one more book in August, and I'm gonna cap it here. I read Transit by Rachel Cusk. I have all of her books, but now I've only read Outline, Transit, in second place. I think one more. I'm blanking. Her writing is just ridiculous. Like this project in terms of the Outline trilogy really looks at how can you make a novel that is mostly observational, which we have characters, we have plot, but it's very as like minimal as you can make it. And how can you make a novel out of that? And Rachel Cusk does it because of the way that she observes the world and the way that she thinks about the novel and what it can contain and how it makes us understand more about ourselves and humanity and connection and dialogue. I think she really encompasses how you can capture reality in the written word, in narrative, in a way that for me as a reader, like I was completely almost in every page of this book, just like, holy shit, like she just like understands how is she able to capture in words that I haven't ever been able to put down into words before. You know what I mean? Like she is the writer that does that. One of my favorite writers. And now that I've read 3 of her books, I can confidently say that. And I'll read everything she's ever written. I can't wait to make my way through all of her catalog, especially her older novels. I'm curious to see how they differ or compare to the Outline trilogy and Second Place, her latest novel. And I know she has a new one coming out in 2024 that sounds amazing. So, anyways, that was my summer of reading. I know summer technically goes over into September, but I've talked for an hour, so let's leave it there. But yeah, I hope this was engaging. I hope you liked hearing me talk about these books. It was a really great summer reading for the most part. I mean, I really liked most of everything I read. And again, let me know what you read this summer. And I hope to check in with you every month like I used to and do a solid monthly wrap up while I continue doing my little author interviews. I hope you're liking those. But, anyways, I will catch you all in the next one.